The wind howled across the frozen expanse like a living thing, carrying shards of ice that stung exposed skin and rattled against the patrol vehicles parked at the staging area. It was the kind of cold that didn't just bite. It gnawed, persistent and patient, waiting for any lapse in attention or preparation. The Northern Ice Patrol had assembled at 0400, their breath forming clouds that crystallized instantly in the sub-zero darkness, and the mission brief had been clear. 12-hour rotation monitoring the commercial ice road, responding to stranded vehicles, checking structural integrity at the crossing points, and maintaining safety protocols for the truckers who relied on this frozen highway to deliver supplies to the remote mining operations 200 miles north. The team consisted of 6 seasoned operators who prided themselves on their endurance and their ability to work through conditions that would send most people scrambling for shelter. There was Marcus, the shift lead, a veteran of 15 winters on the ice with a reputation for never calling off a patrol regardless of weather. Beside him stood Jennifer and Thomas, both in their 4th season, competitive in that unspoken way that colleagues become when they measure themselves against each other's toughness. The 2 rookies, David and Sarah, were eager to prove they belonged, hyper-aware of every word and glance from the veterans. And then there was the logger. Nobody called him by his first name. He was just the logger, a man in his late 50s who had spent 3 decades working timber operations in the far north before transitioning to ice patrol work in what he called his retirement job. He moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had learned every lesson the wilderness could teach and had the scars to prove it. His face was weathered leather, his hands massive and scarred, and he had a habit of checking his gear with ritualistic precision that some of the younger crew found amusing. What really got under their skin, though, was his insistence on what he called toe-warm breaks. Marcus had rolled his eyes the first time the logger brought it up during the preseason training. They were reviewing the standard protocols, communication intervals, vehicle checks, emergency procedures, when the logger raised his hand and suggested adding scheduled micro-breaks specifically for foot care. Not the standard rest stops every few hours, but brief 5-minute intervals every 45 minutes dedicated to checking feet, rotating socks, and ensuring circulation. He'd laid out the whole procedure with the seriousness of someone describing a life-or-death protocol, which to him it was. The reaction had been mixed. The veterans exchanged glances that said, "Here we go again." The rookies tried to keep their faces neutral, unsure whether this was some kind of hazing ritual. Jennifer had actually laughed, quickly covering it with a cough, but the damage was done. Thomas had been more direct, asking if they were going to start scheduling nap times and juice breaks too. The logger had simply looked at him with those pale blue eyes that had seen too many frozen mornings and said, "Laugh now. We'll see who's still got all their toes at season's end." That first patrol day, the mockery had been good-natured but constant. When the logger called for the first toe-warm break after only 45 minutes of work, Marcus had made a show of checking his watch and announcing it to the team over the radio, like it was some kind of kindergarten snack time. Jennifer and Thomas had exchanged grinning glances as they half-heartedly stamped their feet and pretended to check their boots. The rookies, uncertain of the protocol, had tried to follow the logger's example more closely, which only earned them knowing looks from the veterans that clearly said, "Don't encourage him." The logger hadn't been discouraged. He'd found a spot partially sheltered by one of the patrol vehicles, knocked the worst of the snow from his boots, and systematically worked through his routine. He loosened his laces, flexed his toes inside the boots, stamped in a specific pattern that promoted circulation, then retightened with deliberate attention to tension and warmth retention. He checked his inner socks for moisture, adjusted the fit of his vapor barrier liner, and spent a full 2 minutes doing what looked like dance steps, but was actually a carefully designed movement sequence to force blood into the extremities. The whole performance took less than 5 minutes, but to the watching crew, it felt like an elaborate piece of theater designed to showcase his eccentricity. As the season progressed, the toe-warm breaks became a running joke. Whenever someone made a minor mistake or showed any sign of discomfort, Thomas would suggest maybe they needed a toe-warm break. When Jennifer complained about the cold during a particularly brutal midnight shift, Marcus had radioed the logger to ask if she was due for her foot spa appointment. Even the rookies, initially respectful, had gradually absorbed the culture of mockery and began making their own jokes. though David sometimes wondered privately if there might be something to the old man's methods. The logger took it all with the patience of someone who had been through this before. He continued his routine with clockwork precision, never missing an interval, never cutting corners, never responding to the jokes except with an occasional shake of his head. He'd tried a few times to explain the reasoning, something about vasoconstriction and the body's tendency to sacrifice extremities to preserve core temperature, about moisture management and the insidious way wet socks could steal heat, about the early warning signs of frost nip that most people ignored until it was too late. But his explanations were met with polite nods and barely suppressed smiles. They all knew about frostbite after all. This was the ice patrol. They weren't amateurs, but they also weren't the logger. They didn't have his 30 years of winter woods experience, his encyclopedic knowledge of cold injury acquired through personal encounters and the misfortunes of others, his almost obsessive attention to the thousand small details that separated comfort from catastrophe in extreme environments. They saw his caution as overcaution, his discipline as paranoia, his protocols as the quirks of an old man who'd gotten too used to working alone in the woods and couldn't adapt to team dynamics. It all changed on a Tuesday in late January, during what should have been a routine patrol. The forecast had called for moderate cold, -25°C with wind chill dropping at another 10 degrees, which was challenging but well within their operational parameters. They'd handled worse. The overnight shift had reported stable ice conditions, no vehicle incidents, and good visibility. Marcus had even joked during the morning brief that it was going to be an easy day. Maybe they'd actually get to stay warm in the vehicles most of the shift. The weather, as it often did in that country, had other plans. By mid-morning, the temperature had dropped another 15 degrees, and the wind had picked up from a moderate breeze to a sustained 30-knot blast that drove snow horizontally across the ice road and reduced visibility to near whiteout conditions. The patrol couldn't pull off. There were trucks out there, commercial haulers on tight schedules, who wouldn't turn back for anything short of a complete road closure, and someone had to maintain the watch. They'd been out for 6 hours when the call came in. A semi-truck had slid off the road at the Narrows, where the ice road squeezed between two pressure ridges. No injuries, but the driver needed assistance getting back on track, and there was concern about ice integrity in the area. Marcus split the team. He took Jennifer and David in one vehicle to handle the extraction, while Thomas, Sarah, and the logger remained at their checkpoint to maintain watch on the main route and be ready for backup if needed. The extraction took longer than expected. The truck was loaded heavy with mining equipment, the ice was sketchy near the ridge, and the tow vehicle kept losing traction. What should have been a 20-minute job stretched to 2 hours, then 3. The cold was relentless. Marcus could feel it seeping through his gear despite the layers, despite the movement, despite everything. His toes had gone numb after the first hour, but he ignored it. That was normal. That was just how it was when you worked in these temperatures. You pushed through. Jennifer was operating the winch controls, her movements becoming increasingly clumsy as the exposure took its toll. David was on ice safety, checking structural integrity and placing markers, constantly moving to stay warm, but still feeling the cold creeping into his core. None of them wanted to be the first to complain, to show weakness, to suggest they needed a break. This was the job. This was what they'd signed up for. The logger did his weird toe-warm routine, but they were professionals. They could handle it. Back at the checkpoint, Thomas had maintained his position for the full 3 hours without complaint, conducting vehicle checks and radio communications, while snow accumulated on his shoulders and ice formed in his beard. Sarah had lasted 2.5 hours before she quietly mentioned that her feet were getting cold, which Thomas had met with a raised eyebrow and a reminder that this was ice patrol, not a resort. She'd nodded, embarrassed, and gone back to her position. The logger, predictably, had been taking his breaks every 45 minutes like clockwork, which Thomas had noted with increasing irritation. Here they were, doing real work in brutal conditions, and the old man was taking dance breaks every 3/4 of an hour. When Marcus finally radioed that the extraction was complete and they were heading back to the checkpoint, there was an audible note of relief in his voice that he tried to hide. They rendezvoused with the rest of the team, And that's when things started to unravel. Jennifer climbed out of the vehicle and immediately stumbled, catching herself on the door. She laughed it off, blamed the ice. But Marcus noticed she was moving strangely, almost shuffling. David was slower than usual, fumbling with his equipment bag, dropping his radio glove twice before finally securing it. The logger noticed too. He approached Marcus and said quietly, "We need to check feet. Now." Marcus started to wave him off to say they were fine, they'd just been working hard. But something in the logger's tone stopped him. It wasn't lecturing or, "I told you so." It was concern, edged with urgency. "Marcus, feet, now." They moved into the shelter vehicle, the big enclosed utility transport they used as a mobile base. The logger made everyone remove their boots and socks, no exceptions, no arguments. What they found sobered them instantly. Jennifer's toes were waxy white at the tips, completely without sensation. David's left foot showed the telltale blanching of early frostnip across all 5 toes. Even Thomas, who'd been so dismissive, had areas of concerning numbness and discoloration. Sarah's feet were borderline but showed signs of inadequate circulation. Marcus himself was surprised to find his own toes had less feeling than he'd realized, the numbness having crept up so gradually he'd normalized it. The logger moved into action with the calm efficiency of someone who'd done this before. Not panic, not judgment, just methodical care. He had them rate their sensation, checked for hard tissue that would indicate deeper freeze, assessed skin color and temperature. For Jennifer and David, the most affected, he initiated careful rewarming, not the rapid heat that could cause more damage, but controlled warming using their own body heat, dry socks, and the vehicle's heating system set to moderate temperature. He had everyone flex and massage their feet, checking for returning sensation and blood flow. He monitored for the pain that would come with rewarming, the pins and needles agony that actually meant circulation was returning and tissue was being saved. While he worked, he talked them through what had happened. Not accusingly, but educationally. They'd been exposed to extreme cold for extended periods without adequate breaks to check circulation. Their boots had accumulated internal moisture from sweat despite the vapor barriers, creating a heat-stealing layer next to their skin. The constant pressure from standing and working had compressed insulation and restricted blood flow. Their focus on the task had overridden the subtle warning signs their bodies had been sending. The progressive numbness, the clumsy movements, the difficulty with fine motor control. They'd pushed through, which was admirable in one sense and dangerous in another, because you couldn't push through physiology. The body would protect the core by sacrificing the periphery, and if you didn't intervene, it would make that trade without asking permission. Jennifer was the worst off. Her toes remained white and numb even after 20 minutes of careful rewarming, and the logger made the call to get her to the medical station for evaluation. The helicopter evacuation in those conditions would be complicated, but it was necessary. David's condition improved more quickly. He was younger, better circulation, and he'd caught it earlier in the progression. Within 40 minutes, he had partial sensation returning, though the pain was significant enough that the logger had him on pain management protocols and closely monitored for complications. The incident shook the team in a way that no amount of training or warnings had managed. This wasn't theoretical. This wasn't the logger being paranoid. This was real damage to real people, and it had happened fast, under conditions they'd all considered manageable. Jennifer ended up with second-degree frostbite on 3 toes. Not severe enough for amputation, but severe enough for a painful recovery and permanent cold sensitivity that would affect the rest of her career. David recovered fully, but carried the knowledge that he'd been 30 minutes from something much worse. The investigation and incident report that followed were thorough and uncomfortable. The safety committee wanted to know why established protocols hadn't been followed, why the team had remained in exposure conditions for so long without rotating out, why none of them had recognized the warning signs sooner. Marcus took responsibility as shift lead, but the truth was more complex. They'd all been complicit in a culture that valued toughness over prudence, that saw breaks as weakness, that had mocked the one person who'd tried to implement better practices. The logger, to his credit, didn't say, "I told you so." He simply participated in the investigation with the same methodical thoroughness he brought to everything, laying out the physiology, the risk factors, the early intervention protocols that could have prevented the injuries. When asked why he thought the team hadn't adopted his suggested toe-warm breaks, he'd shrugged and said, "People don't believe in prevention until they've seen the cost of not preventing. Now they've seen it." The recommendation from the safety committee was unambiguous. Implement mandatory foot care intervals on all ice patrol operations. Not optional, not suggested, but required protocol with the same weight as radio checks and vehicle inspections. The loggers' 5-minute, 45-minute intervals became official policy. More than that, the committee mandated training on cold injury recognition, circulation management, and the specific warning signs that the team had missed or ignored. The cultural shift was harder than the policy change. When the team returned to full operations 2 weeks later, Jennifer still on medical leave, but everyone else cleared for duty, there was an awkwardness that hung over the first few shifts. Nobody quite knew how to acknowledge what had happened, how to move forward without either dwelling on the incident or pretending it hadn't occurred. Thomas, who'd been among the most dismissive of the loggers' methods, was quieter than usual, almost subdued. Sarah seemed to second-guess herself constantly, hyper-aware of every sensation in her feet. David had become almost paranoid about cold exposure, checking his toes compulsively. It was Marcus who finally broke the tension during their first official toe-warm break under the new protocols. When the timer went off after 45 minutes of patrol, he called everyone to positions and then said over the radio, "All right, folks, time for our foot spa appointments, and I mean that seriously. Check your gear, check your feet, and check each other. The logger's been doing this longer than most of us have been alive, and he's got all his toes to show for it. Let's learn from someone who knows what they're doing." The logger, monitoring the channel, allowed himself a small smile but said nothing. He just proceeded with his routine, and this time the others watched and learned. They saw how he systematically checked for moisture, how he adjusted lacing tension to maximize circulation without compromising support, how his movement sequence was designed to force blood into the extremities through muscle contraction and positioning. They noticed how he checked between his toes for early signs of maceration or friction damage, how he rotated between sock systems to manage moisture, how he assessed boot temperature and made adjustments to insulation layers. David started asking questions, real questions, not dismissive ones. How did you know when laces were too tight? What were the specific movement patterns for different cold levels? How did you distinguish between normal numbness and dangerous numbness? The logger answered each one with the patience of someone who'd waited a long time for anyone to actually want to learn. Thomas, listening on the radio, found himself making mental notes. Sarah began mimicking the logger's routine, her movements becoming less uncertain as she developed muscle memory for the protocols. Over the following weeks, something remarkable happened. The foot care breaks, initially viewed as an imposed burden, began to feel natural. The team started recognizing the value not just in checking their feet, but in the forced pause itself. Those 5-minute intervals became assessment points for everything: how they were feeling, how the equipment was holding up, what conditions were developing, whether their work pace was sustainable. The breaks created natural decision points that prevented the kind of tunnel vision that had led to the incident. More importantly, they began to see the warning signs earlier. 2 weeks after returning to operations, Thomas noticed his left boot was developing a pressure point that was restricting circulation. 6 weeks earlier, he would have pushed through until it became a problem. Now, he called a break, adjusted his lacing, and added a supplemental insulation layer. Crisis prevented. A month later, Sarah caught early signs of moisture accumulation in her socks during a routine check. She had a spare pair ready, another logger protocol they'd adopted, and made the swap before it became a thermal problem. David started carrying a detailed checklist of the warning signs and checking himself against it at every break, which some might have found obsessive, but which the logger recognized as the behavior of someone who'd learned a lesson and wasn't going to repeat the mistake. The real test came during an early February cold snap that pushed temperatures down to -40, with wind chills approaching -60. These were conditions that pushed the absolute limits of their operational parameters, the kind of cold where exposed skin could freeze in under 2 minutes, and where equipment failure could be life-threatening. The forecast had given them advance warning, and there was serious discussion about whether to suspend operations entirely. Marcus made the call to maintain operations, but with modified protocols, shorter patrol segments, more frequent check-ins, mandatory buddy systems, and absolutely no deviation from the tow-warm break schedule. The logger added an additional recommendation: reduce the interval from 45 minutes to 35 in these extreme conditions, and extend the break duration from 5 minutes to 7 to allow for more thorough warming and assessment. Some of the other patrol teams had scoffed at the caution, but Marcus's team unanimously supported the measures. They'd learned the hard way what happened when you didn't respect the cold. That shift became legendary within the ice patrol community. They worked 12 hours in the most brutal conditions any of them had ever experienced, conditions that would have broken most teams. But they followed the protocols religiously. Every 35 minutes, like clockwork, they stopped for their 7-minute foot care breaks. They checked each other, enforced the protocols on anyone who tried to skip steps, and maintained constant communication about their condition. Thomas and David worked in rotating pairs, each one watching the other for signs of cold injury. Sarah and the logger formed another team. Her eagerness to learn matched with his experience. Marcus floated between groups, coordinating and checking on everyone. The result was extraordinary. Despite the extreme conditions, despite 12 hours of exposure, despite work that involved long periods of standing on ice and operating equipment in temperatures that made metal brittle and hydraulics sluggish, not one person showed signs of cold injury. Not one case of frostnip. Not one incident of dangerous numbness. Their performance remained sharp throughout the shift because they weren't fighting through progressive cold damage. Their morale stayed high because they felt in control of their safety rather than at the mercy of the elements. And when they finally completed the shift and returned to base, every single person could still feel their toes. The other patrol teams, the ones who'd scoffed at the precautions, hadn't fared as well. There were 3 cold injury cases that night, all requiring medical evaluation, all involving operators who'd pushed through without adequate breaks. The contrast was stark enough that the safety committee launched a review of operations across all teams, not just Marcus's crew. What they found was revealing. Over the 3 months since implementing the tow-warm break protocols, Marcus's team had seen a dramatic reduction in cold-related incidents. They compiled the data carefully, tracking everything from minor frostnip that resolved without intervention to serious injuries requiring medical treatment. They compared it against the previous season's data and against the other teams who hadn't adopted the protocols as thoroughly. The numbers were striking. 53% reduction in cold injury incidents, 53% fewer cases of frostnip, frostbite, and dangerous numbness, 53% fewer medical interventions, fewer lost work days, fewer permanent injuries that would affect long-term career capacity. It wasn't just raw numbers either. The severity of incidents that did occur was notably lower, suggesting that the early detection enabled by regular checks was catching problems before they progressed to serious damage. But the impact went beyond injury statistics. The team's operational efficiency had actually improved despite the lost time to breaks. They made better decisions because they weren't working through cold-induced cognitive impairment. Their equipment lasted longer because they were checking and maintaining it more frequently. Their communication was better because the breaks created natural synchronization points. And perhaps most importantly, their culture had shifted from one of machismo and toughing it out to one of professional competence and mutual care. The logger became something of a reluctant celebrity within the Ice Patrol organization. Other teams started requesting training sessions with him. The safety committee asked him to develop formal protocols based on his methods. He was invited to speak at the Regional Winter Operations Conference, an invitation he initially declined before Marcus convinced him it was important. His presentation was characteristically straightforward. No PowerPoint slides, no jargon, just practical demonstrations and clear explanations of why each step mattered. What struck people most was his humility about it. He didn't present himself as some kind of wilderness guru or survival expert. He was just a guy who'd spent a lot of time cold and had figured out how not to lose body parts to it. He'd made mistakes, seen others make mistakes, and developed protocols that minimized risk. When someone asked him what the secret was, he'd shrugged and said, "There's no secret. Your body will tell you what it needs if you stop and listen. The tow-warm breaks just force you to stop and listen before it's too late." Jennifer eventually returned to duty, though her recovery had been long and painful. Her damaged toes healed, but they never regained full sensation, and she had to wear specialized insulation systems to prevent re-injury. She could have been bitter about it, could have blamed the culture or the conditions or the lack of protocols. Instead, she became one of the most vocal advocates for the new methods. She talked openly about what she'd gone through, about the moment in the shelter vehicle, when she'd realized her toes were white and numb and she couldn't feel anything, about the weeks of painful recovery and the knowledge that it could have been prevented. Her testimony carried weight precisely because she'd been a skeptic. She'd laughed at the toe-warm breaks. She'd pushed through discomfort out of pride and competitiveness. She'd paid a price for that, and she didn't want anyone else to pay the same one. When new recruits joined the Ice Patrol, she made sure they understood that the protocols weren't suggestions or the quirks of an paranoid old logger. They were lessons written in tissue damage and near misses and the accumulated wisdom of people who'd learned the hard way. By the end of that season, the toe-warm brake protocols had been adopted across the entire Ice Patrol system. What had started as one man's insistence on careful foot care had become standard operating procedure for winter operations throughout the region. The implementation wasn't always perfect. There were still teams that cut corners, individuals who thought the rules didn't apply to them, supervisors who prioritized task completion over safety. But the culture was shifting. The data was too clear to ignore. The 50% reduction in cold injury incidents wasn't just a number on a report. It represented real people who still had full function of their extremities, who didn't carry permanent cold sensitivity, who could work full careers instead of being medically retired in their 30s. The logger himself remained largely unchanged by his newfound recognition. He continued his routine with the same methodical precision he'd always employed, neither proud nor humble about it, just consistently doing what worked. He did take some satisfaction, though, in watching the others adopt his methods, not because it validated him. He'd never needed validation, but because it meant fewer people would experience what Jennifer had, what he'd seen dozens of others experience over his decades in the cold. Thomas, in particular, had undergone the most dramatic transformation. The same guy who'd made the juice break crack during training had become almost evangelical about proper cold weather protocols. He'd taken it upon himself to learn everything the logger could teach him, asking questions during every break, taking notes, practicing the techniques until they became second nature. He started carrying extra gear specifically to help others: spare socks, emergency warming packs, backup insulation layers. When asked about the change, he'd simply said, "I was an idiot. The old man tried to tell us, and I was too stupid to listen. Not making that mistake again." David had channeled his near miss into becoming a cold weather safety specialist. He'd read everything he could find about thermoregulation, cold injury pathology, and prevention protocols. He'd worked with the safety committee to refine the training program, adding specific scenarios and practical exercises that helped people understand not just what to do, but why it mattered. His checklist system, initially just a personal tool to manage his own anxiety about cold exposure, had been adopted more widely as a standardized assessment tool that gave operators concrete criteria for evaluating their condition. Sarah had discovered she had a talent for mentoring. As newer recruits joined the patrol, she found herself naturally falling into a teaching role, passing on what she'd learned from the logger and from the incident. She was good at it too, finding ways to explain complex physiological concepts in practical terms, demonstrating techniques with patience and clarity, creating an environment where questions were encouraged rather than seen as signs of weakness. The logger had noticed and quietly started steering more of the training responsibilities her way, recognizing that she had gifts for communication that he'd never possessed. Marcus had grown as a leader through the experience. The incident had been a professional failure in one sense. People under his supervision had been injured on his watch, but he'd responded to it by becoming more thoughtful about team culture and safety management. He'd learned that real leadership wasn't about pushing through regardless of conditions, but about creating an environment where people could voice concerns, where protocols were respected, where prevention was valued over toughness. His team had become the model for how Ice Patrol operations should function, and he'd found himself mentoring other shift leads on how to build that kind of culture. The ice road season ended in late March when warming temperatures made the route unstable. The final patrol was ceremonial in a way, a last check before the ice broke up and the road disappeared until next winter. The team gathered at their usual staging area as dawn broke over the frozen expanse, the light turning the ice 100 shades of blue and gold. They'd all survived another season. More than that, they'd all thrived, working some of the most demanding conditions in their careers without serious injury. Before they began the final patrol, Marcus called everyone together. It wasn't formal, just the team standing in a circle in the early morning cold, their breath mingling in the frozen air. He thanked them for their work, their professionalism, their commitment to each other. And then he turned to the logger and said, "You tried to tell us. We should have listened from the start. Thank you for not giving up on us, even when we were being idiots about it." The logger, uncomfortable with the attention as always, just nodded. But there was something in his expression, a softness around the eyes, that suggested the acknowledgement meant something. He'd spent most of his career working alone in the woods, responsible only for himself. And these months with the ice patrol had given him something he hadn't expected. The satisfaction of knowing his hard-won knowledge had protected others, that his insistence on protocols had prevented suffering, that his refusal to give in to mockery had literally saved tissue and function and careers. "Just feet," he said finally. "Just taking care of your feet. Nothing complicated about it." "Yeah," Thomas replied. "Just feet. And maybe everything else that matters." They completed that final patrol with the same careful attention to protocol they'd maintained all season. Every 35 minutes they stopped for their 7-minute breaks. They checked their feet, their gear, each other. They monitored conditions and adjusted their approach as needed. And when they finally completed the circuit and returned to base for the last time, every person on that team had all their toes, full sensation, and the knowledge that they'd learned something important. The story of the Ice Patrol team and their toe-warm break protocols spread beyond their immediate organization. Winter operations crews from other industries, forestry, mining, search and rescue, remote construction, began reaching out to learn about the methods. The logger found himself traveling occasionally during the off-season, sharing his knowledge with others who worked in the cold, always emphasizing the same core principles: prevention over treatment, awareness over toughness, consistent protocols over situational judgment. The data continued to support the approach. Over the following seasons, the 50% reduction in cold injury incidents held steady and even improved slightly as the protocols became more ingrained in operational culture. Insurance companies took notice, offering reduced premiums for organizations that could demonstrate implementation of comprehensive cold injury prevention programs. Regulatory bodies began incorporating similar requirements into their winter operations standards. What had been dismissed as one man's paranoia had become industry best practice, backed by data and validated by outcomes. But for the original team, the members who'd lived through the transformation, the impact was more personal than statistical. Jennifer could work a full shift without fear of re-injuring her damaged toes because she knew the protocols would catch problems early. David had overcome his anxiety about cold exposure by channeling it into systematic safety practices. Sarah had found a calling in teaching others to work safely in extreme conditions. Thomas had learned humility and the value of listening to experience. Marcus had become the kind of leader who prioritized people over productivity, understanding that they weren't actually opposing values. And the logger continued his routine, season after season, with the same quiet competence he'd always brought to his work. He never sought recognition, never wrote a book, or started a consulting company, or tried to monetize his knowledge. He just showed up, did the work, took care of his feet, and quietly ensured that the people around him did the same. In his own mind, he wasn't a hero or a pioneer. He was just someone who'd figured out how not to lose body parts to the cold, and didn't see any reason why others should have to learn that lesson the hard way. The legacy of those toe-warm breaks extended far beyond the immediate team or even the Ice Patrol organization. The principles they embodied, regular assessment, early intervention, systematic care, cultural support for safety over toughness, became embedded in how modern winter operations were conducted. Training programs incorporated the methods. Safety protocols formalized the intervals. Equipment manufacturers developed better systems for moisture management and temperature regulation based on feedback from operators who were now systematically monitoring these factors. Years later, when researchers studied the dramatic reduction in cold weather occupational injuries across northern industries, they traced much of the improvement back to a shift in operational culture that had its roots in one team's experience on the ice patrol. The specific protocols varied by industry and situation, but the underlying philosophy was the same. Take care of the small things before they become big things, listen to your body before it forces you to listen, and respect experience even when it seems overcautious. For anyone working in cold environments, whether commercially or recreationally, the lessons from the ice patrol team remain relevant and potentially life-saving. Understanding the progressive nature of cold injury, recognizing that numbness is a warning sign rather than something to ignore, knowing that prevention is far easier than treatment, appreciating that scheduled breaks for assessment can prevent hours or days of suffering. These insights can mean the difference between completing a winter season with full function or carrying permanent damage. The human body is remarkably resilient, but also remarkably vulnerable to cold. It will sacrifice extremities to preserve core temperature, and it will do so silently, gradually, in ways that can seem manageable until they suddenly aren't. Pushing through discomfort might feel heroic in the moment, but there's nothing heroic about preventable injury. Real competence in cold environments comes not from toughness, but from systematic vigilance, not from endurance, but from awareness, not from pride, but from the wisdom to implement protocols that work. If you're someone who spends time in winter conditions, whether for work or recreation, whether casually or professionally, consider what the Ice Patrol team learned. Those breaks to check your feet, to assess your condition, to address small problems before they become catastrophic. They're not weakness. They're intelligence. The logger understood that from decades of experience. His team learned it the hard way. You have the opportunity to learn it the easy way, by applying proven protocols before you ever need to find out what happens when you don't. This is the kind of knowledge that saves tissue, prevents suffering, and preserves careers. It's not glamorous. It's not exciting. It's just systematic care applied consistently over time, and the results speak for themselves. 50% reduction in cold injury incidents, 50% fewer people dealing with frostbite damage, 50% fewer cases of permanent cold sensitivity that affects quality of life for decades. Those numbers represent real people, people who can still feel their toes, who don't dread winter conditions, who can work full careers in the environments they love. The story of the Ice Patrol team is ultimately about learning to respect both the environment and the wisdom of those who've worked in it successfully for years. It's about overcoming the cultural inertia that makes us mock precautions even when they're clearly necessary. It's about the courage to change our approach when evidence shows we're wrong. And it's about the satisfaction that comes from protecting not just ourselves but our colleagues. Building a culture where everyone goes home whole at the end of the season. So, if you found this story valuable, if you recognize yourself in any of these characters, if you've ever pushed through numbness or mocked someone else's caution or wondered whether there might be better ways to work safely in the cold, stay with us. Subscribe to this channel for more stories from the field, more practical knowledge from people who've learned these lessons in real conditions, more insights into survival and safety that could genuinely make a difference in your life or the life of someone you work with. We're building a community of people who respect both the power of nature and the intelligence of proven protocols, and we'd love to have you as part of it. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us as we explore the real-world lessons that separate safe winter operations from preventable disasters. Your toes will thank you.